So in the previous video, we discussed some common sources of post-traumatic stress disorder, things like war or combat, torture, natural disasters, and so forth. Each of these contribute to the development of either acute stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. But you might ask yourself, why is it that some people develop a stress related disorder and other people don't? So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the features linked to developing a stress disorder. So the contributing factors that I'm going to talk to you about are biological factors, personality, childhood experience, social support, and the severity of the trauma itself. Each of these contribute to whether a person develops PTSD, and I would suggest that they're not additive. They're not one-to-one, they're actually interrelated. So let's talk about biological or genetic factors linked to a stress disorder. We know that trauma triggers physical changes in the brain, and that's one of the sources that leads to the severe stress that we have. If we were to do a pedigree study, which is mapping out the family history of a condition, we tend to see that moms who have high levels of cortisol pass that on to their children, right? Which that in of itself is going to increase the odds of that child acquiring PTSD. Now, we also have to be mindful that there are neurotransmitters at play as well, things like norepinephrine, which you might hear referred to as noradrenaline, right? So these are chemicals in the brain that are responsible for creating a reaction. But depending on your biological or genetic predisposition, you're going to secrete more norepinephrine or cortisol than the next person. We also tend to see that people who develop PTSD tend to have higher activity in various brain regions, like the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus is likely responsible for the flashbacks and the memories associated with PTSD. And the amygdala is responsible for the emotions or the feelings of fear or anxiety related to PTSD. Now, personality factors that are relevant to PTSD, we tend to see that based on an individual's personality, they tend to cope better than other people. So if a person had higher anxiety pre-trauma, they're going to be more likely to develop PTSD than a person who had low anxiety pre-trauma. If a person has a history of psychological distress or other psychological disorders, they're going to be more likely to be to acquire PTSD than someone who does not have a history of psychological disorders. And one's mindset matters as well. So people who have a negative worldview tend to have higher rates of PTSD than people who are more optimistic. So those are the risk factors, but we also have to be mindful of protective factors like resiliency. Resiliency is protective against stress-related disorders. So the more resilient, the more a person is able to adapt or adjust to stress, the less likely they are to develop PTSD. So childhood experiences matter too. So the more negative or adverse childhood experiences one has, which are referred to as ACEs, ACE, the more likely a person is going to develop PTSD. So things like poverty increases the risk of PTSD. A family history with psychological disorders increases the risk of PTSD in the children. Any experience of abuse, assault, major catastrophe at an early age could increase the risk of PTSD. And even divorce and separation at a young age are risk factors to PTSD. Now, our support system, our support network is also vital to helping us cope. So, the more developed your support system, the better. So, we see that people who have a weak or underdeveloped support system are going to be more likely to develop a stress related disorder after some kind of negative event. And then finally, we have to be mindful of the severity of the trauma, right? If a person has more direct exposure to a trauma, they are more likely to develop a stress related disorder like PTSD. Uh, Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot experience vicarious trauma, right? So, experiencing or observing another person's traumatic experience could also lead to you developing trauma. But we do see the the more direct the exposure of the trauma is, the more likely you're going to develop it. Okay, what are some risky experiences that are um, heightening the risk of PTSD? If you see some kind of severe injury or mutilation or death or significant injury to another person, that could uh, facilitate the development of things like PTSD. Now, once again, when I go over these, I want you to see some of the highlights. I I I do not have the time to go through every possible scenario or example, but this is a pretty good starting point in trying to think about why it is that some people develop uh, psychological stress disorders and others don't. So let's stop there. And the final video that I have on this topic is related to treatment. So, but that'll be separate.